Hello, everyone. Welcome to the African Creative Economy Investor Masterclass series organized by the Creative Economy Practice at CcHUB. My name is Blessing Azubike, and I'm Senior Program Manager at the Creative Economy Practice at CcHUB. Our mission here at the Creative Economy Practice is to enhance job and wealth creation and opportunities for creative expression for Africans, particularly women and young people, through innovation and the application of technology in the African creative economy. Our work focuses on 4 pillars: research, community and ecosystem development, and investment readiness and investments. Within our work around investment, we do a lot of investor education and advocacy. And one of our programs, which we're here for today, is the African Creative Economy Investor Masterclass series. This session is for existing funders or investors seeking to begin or scale up funding and/or investment in the creative economy in Africa. We created this series to support African institutions to build their knowledge of creative economy funding approaches, develop critical relationships and networks, and secure strategic partnerships that will add value to existing or planned work in this area. Each year we've had 3 sessions, or we usually would have 3 sessions comprising 2 virtual sessions and 1 face-to-face session. In today's edition, the first for 2023, we'll be looking at understanding the African creative economy, an overview of the current state and potential of the African creative economy, including key sectors, growth trends, and investment opportunities. Our speakers are John Newbigin OBE, who is partner and chair at Counterculture Partnerships LLP, and Ojoma Ochai, who is managing partner at the Creative Economy Practice at CcHUB. And now, without further ado, I'll just bring up our first speaker, John Newbigin, who will be taking us through an overview of the creative economy, funding and investment models to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. John Newbigin is the co-founder and first chair of Creative England. As special advisor to the UK Minister of Culture, he was part of the team that developed the UK government's first policies for the creative industries in the 90s. He has written and talked extensively about the creative industries and worked with governments and public agencies around the world on creative economy policies. He is London Mayor Sadiq Khan's ambassador for the creative industries and a board member of the London Economic Action Partnership and the Mayor's Cultural Leadership Board for London. He's a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London, and an honorary professor at the University of Hong Kong, where he was one of a team delivering the Advanced Cultural Leadership Program. He's partnership and chair at Counterculture LLP, and of the PEC International Advisory Council on the Creative Economy. He has been a mentor and speaker for the CLAW Leadership Program. He was until early 2022 chair of the British Council's Advisory Group for Arts and Creative Economy. For 10 years, he was a neighborhood community worker and writer in residence for Common Stock Theatre. He has also worked as a journalist and as an illustrator. He was awarded an OBE for services to creative industries and the arts in the Queen's 2015 New Year's Honors List. Thank you so much, John, for being here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. The floor is yours.
Blessing, thank you. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here this afternoon. I'm an old friend of Ojoma, and I'm sure you all know Ojoma is a powerful thinker and actor. I think this is a great idea, this masterclass series, not least because all around the world, people are recognizing that the next area of real growth and expansion in the creative economy is going to be Africa. So it's a privilege for me to be part of this, and I look forward to talking with you this afternoon. So if I go to my slide deck, here we are. I've divided this talk for 20 minutes just into three chapters, if you like. What is the creative economy? I think it's worth reminding ourselves exactly what we mean by that. Secondly, what are the challenges that investors face in getting involved in the creative economy? And then some thoughts on how those challenges. So the first one in 1998, when we started working on the creative economy, we came up with this definition, which is really focused on individual skill and talent, and recognizes that the core of the creative industries is intellectual property. But after a while, that definition proved to be inadequate. And here's, I think, a much more interesting definition produced by the United Nations in 2008. I won't bother to read it all out, but the idea that this is not just about the economy, it's also about society and about culture, and it is ultimately about the environment and about human development. So how you define the creative economy is something about which people will continue to argue about until the end of the world. Quite honestly, I don't think it matters too much, and I'm going to explain a little bit why. But here in 2014, an organization called Nesta came up with a much simpler definition, which is simply those sectors which specialize in the use of creative talent for commercial purposes. I think that is a very, very simple statement about the creative economy. But here is something even simpler, produced by a regional development official who I was speaking with in the center of England. And she said to me, when you come down to it, the creative economy is a state of mind. People who are thinking creatively are part of the creative economy. And I really like that definition, because in the end of the day, we can decide which sectors are creative and which sectors are not creative, but every part of the economy has aspects that are creative, and many creative industries have all kinds of jobs that are not creative. So in the end of the day, in a sense, it is just a state of mind. But the one thing we do know is that it's becoming more and more important all around the world. And here in London, here's our lovely mayor, Mr. Sadiq Khan. In London, we calculate the creative industries are generating around 65 billion US for the London economy every year. It's a huge part of our economy. It's 15% of all the jobs in the city. And perhaps as importantly, 80% of visitors who come to London say they come because the cultural and creative life of London is so dynamic. So one of our arguments is, one of the reasons why the financial sector has been strong in London is because bankers like to live in London because it's such a good city to live in. So you can't disentangle the creative industries from other parts of the economy. And in London, it's a central part of the way we plan the future of our city. And our cultural strategy and our economic strategy, we try to ensure is integrated as fully as possible, because we recognize that these two things are important. And just in passing, I'd say it interested me that a piece I read in The Economist magazine just before the recent presidential election in Nigeria said, for all the fact that we think of Nigeria as being fundamentally an oil economy, actually the three most successful parts of the economy at the moment are music, film, and fashion, all core to the creative industries. All around the world, this is becoming more and more important. Now, after the pandemic, of course, the creative industries took a huge hit, something like 750 billion US in the course of 2020. But I came across this report recently produced for Netflix by the consultancy agency Deloitte. They studied 9 countries, and they estimate on the basis of that study that between now and 2030, in those 9 countries alone, the creative sector is likely to grow by 8 million jobs and 40% in terms of GVA. So after the impact of the COVID pandemic on the creative sector, which was massive, the rebound is very, very speedy and encouraging. Now, here's a further proof of that. The Asian Development Bank Institute produced a series of essays on the Creative Economy 2030, looking at, as they say here in their title, imagining and delivering a robust, creative, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. Their argument is that the creative economy is crucial to building an economy which is sustainable because it is not very intensive in terms of energy use or waste generation, but also it's inclusive in the sense that it provides opportunities, particularly for women and young people. And Blessing, I noticed that in your introduction, you said your institute is particularly concerned about opportunities of inclusivity for young people and for women. This is an economy which is labor intensive rather than capital intensive, and therefore the barriers to entry are low. And it means that people with creative talent, even if they haven't got a higher university degree, have just as much opportunity of success as people who have an MBA from Stanford. here's another point which I think is worth making. The Indonesian government initiated a World Conference on Creative Economy in 2018. The next edition of this will be in Tashkent in Uzbekistan next summer. So even in Central Asia, where economies are just beginning to really accelerate in the 21st century, they see that the creative economy is important. And at the most recent meeting, World Conference on Creative Economy, which was in Bali last September, 35 countries represented. I think 11 were states from Africa. So there's this huge and growing interest in your part of the world in what's happening with the creative industries. And just to finish off this little section of my talk, I had a conversation with the senior government official in the culture department in the Ministry of Culture in Azerbaijan. And you probably know that Azerbaijan is very much an oil-dependent economy. And he said to me, we have got to stop investing in black gold, i.e. oil, and start investing in human gold. In other words, the young people of Azerbaijan. And that's a statement and an observation which is being reflected in more and more countries all over the world. So, having said that and saying this is a growth sector, certainly in the UK and in many other countries where data is collected, the creative industries are generating jobs at least twice the rate of the underlying rate for the economy as a whole. So it's hugely significant. But what are the challenges? One of the challenges, of course, is that so much of the creative economy is informal. It is small micro businesses, very often individual freelancers. They keep themselves below the radar. They don't want to be paying tax, perhaps, but equally, they want to just be getting on with their work. They're such small businesses that many of them don't register officially. It means that it is very difficult to estimate the value of this economy and to also calculate what are the skills needs and the investment needs and the market needs of the people who produce in it. So the International Labour Organization reckons something like 60% of the world's economy is informal. It's probably more than that in the creative sector, but it is a huge issue for investors, this degree of informality. So that is certainly one challenge. And a related challenge is data. Now, I've just pulled up, this is a sheet from what are called the standard industrial classification codes around the world. And these are some of the areas under which they define the creative industries. The problem is that the codes lag far behind the reality of what is happening in the creative sector. So even using the official designation for how we define some of these sectors, there is not adequate internationally gathered data so that we can compare growth and trends and needs across the creative sector. So it's informal, but it's also very difficult to get accurate data about what's going on. Another big challenge for investors. Thirdly, this is a front page from a report produced last year in the UK by our Policy and Evidence Centre. It identified over 700 small microclusters of creative businesses, that is 50 related businesses or less within a geographic area that we had not identified as being creative clusters. My point in showing you this is that the sector is also very, very fragmented. It is hundreds of thousands of small businesses, lone freelance operators working in different areas, music, film, fashion, all intercut with each other, but they're all separate industries. It's highly fragmented. That is a huge problem for investors. It's not like the car industry or the construction industry or the oil industry. It is dealing with hundreds and thousands of small operators whose investment needs are very, very small and therefore may not be of interest to banks and commercial investors. Another challenge. Secondly, well, fourthly, fifthly, wherever I've got to, the intellectual property is key to the creative economy. What that means is that the products of the creative economy are fundamentally about ideas. And of course, the problem with an idea is it's completely intangible. You cannot go to the bank and say, lend me $1,000 because I've got a great idea, because you have no collateral to offer. It's a huge problem. And this issue of identifying and valuing intellectual property is a problem for governments, it's a problem for investors, and a problem for creative entrepreneurs, because people very often don't recognize the value of their own intellectual property. I was speaking to a woman who runs the intellectual property office in Jamaica, who told me that a recent study done by WIPO, the World Organization on Intellectual Property, calculated that the royalties generated by the Jamaican music industry are greater than the gross value added of their bauxite industry and their agricultural sector, which are the two areas of the economy that the government takes seriously. So intellectual property is a huge contributor to Jamaica's overall national wealth, but it's very difficult to calculate. That is another challenge for investors. And finally, one of the issues about the creative economy is, how do we measure success? Here is a quote which I will read out because it's worth focusing on, by a prominent UK economist, Diane Coyle. She says, any task that can be measured by the metrics of productivity, in other words, output per hour, is a task that we want automation to do. Productivity is for robots. What humans excel at is wasting time, playing, experimenting, creating, and exploring. None of these activities fare well under the scrutiny of productivity. That's why science and art and creative industries are hard to fund, but they are also the foundations of long-term growth. Most metrics for economic success are based on metrics such as productivity. They simply do not apply in the creative sector, where originality is the key, originality and creativity. So if we sum those things up, the problems for investors are, it's informal, which creates a problem for investors. It's not properly measured, which creates a problem. It's highly fragmented, which creates a problem. It's intangible, which creates all kinds of problems. And it's not properly understood by those who try to assess the value of an economy. So these are huge and fundamental challenges that investors have to face. So my next section, which I hope is a little bit more optimistic, and finally, just before I get on to that, the point to really raise here is that however difficult it is to measure and however difficult it is to invest in the creative economy, the point is it's everywhere. It's not like oil or minerals or cash crops. Talent is everywhere. Opportunity is not. When we started Creative England 10 years ago, that was our mantra. Talent is everywhere, in villages, the countryside, small towns, all over our country. The problem is, how do we connect talent with opportunity? So what I want to talk about now briefly at the end is how these challenges can be met. And I think, to keep it simple, I've just identified three major ways that I think investors can overcome some of those challenges. The first one is to think about investing in businesses, not projects. People come with a project. Somebody's got a great idea for a film. Somebody's got a great idea for a piece of music. Somebody's got a great idea for a festival. That's all well and good, but success in the creative economy has nearly always come by investing in slates rather than individual winners. In other words, in the film industry, typically in Hollywood, investment will be spread over a number of different films, because out of 10 films, one might make a lot of money. 3 might just about do all right. The rest of them probably don't make any money at all. So you only get your money back. You can only get a return on your investment if you're spreading your bets, rather than trying to pick individual winners, to look at slates. And again, with Creative England, are investing in very small micro businesses. How we engaged investors was by saying, here's a group of companies in which you can invest. Not all of them are going to be successful, but some of them will be. And you don't know, because you don't know until they're up and running how successful they're going to be. So you spread your bet. Slates, not winners. The second point, which I think is really useful to bear in mind, is the emphasis is very often on startups. Let's invest in a startup. Let's find a smart kid who's got a great idea and invest money in them. Because I worked in the film industry, what I know is any idiot can be a first-time filmmaker. The question is, can they be a second-time filmmaker and a third-time filmmaker? So the issue for investors is, how do you begin to identify people who have got the potential to grow their single one idea from a project into something which is a business, which generates more than one project, will go on growing, will go on generating revenue. It's a business, not a project. Then thirdly, loans, not grants. Again, one of the temptations, I think, for many governments around the world and for investors around the world is they see the creative economy as something which needs to be supported from ground zero with grants and subsidies. Of course, grants are important for people who are right at the beginning of their business. But in my experience, it has always been much better in all the work that I've done in the UK and internationally to look at investing in terms of loans, not grants. Because if you're giving a small business operator a loan, they have an incentive to pay back. They have to be thinking about business disciplines. If it's simply a grant, it's very easy for them to burn through the money and then the business crashes. If it's a loan, not only do they have to think about how to manage their business affairs so that they can pay back the loan, but as the investor, you can say, I'm going to come and check your business figures every month because I want to make sure you're in a position to repay that loan. So again, with Creative England, as an intermediary organization, we were able to say to companies, we will loan you money, but we're also going to constantly monitor and support you in your business so you're in a position to pay it back. And it encourages financial discipline in people who are very often very interested in the creativity of their idea, but maybe not so interested in the business dimension of their idea. And then finally, to think about investing in teams rather than individual geniuses. All the research that has been done demonstrates that successful creative businesses are businesses where the creative people, the technology people, and the finance people treat each other with equal esteem. If you have a business completely run by creative people, it's often rather romantic and unrealistic. If it's completely run by the tech people, nobody understands it. And if it's completely run by the finance people, it's boring and it never takes any risks. So spread your bets. Slates, not winners. Scale-ups, not startups. Loans, not grants. Teams, geniuses. And then finally, thinking about investing in the value chain. One of the mantras that we had at Creative England was we have to be thinking about money, markets, and networks. Creative entrepreneurs and investors very often focus on the money, but the really difficult issue is how do you connect the business with markets, particularly markets that are changing fast, markets that are international and global, and how do you connect them with networks of other related businesses who can help them create an effective supply chain and a value chain. So money, markets, networks. Don't just get obsessed with money. Think about the whole value chain, the markets and the networks. Secondly, an obvious point, infrastructure, not just roads and railways and airlines, but digital infrastructure. You cannot have, in the 21st century, a really effective, functioning, creative economy without a strong digital infrastructure. We're trying to develop at least some focus on 5G hotspots where internet coverage is not very effective, so that it encourages creative businesses to come together and work together. Thirdly, and an obvious point, is skills. If nobody's investing in skills, you cannot have an effective creative economy. And when the skills needs are changing very, very rapidly, keeping up to date with skills needs is hugely important. And I will come on to that in a moment. And then finally, I think when people think about the creative industries, they're constantly thinking about investing in supply, in money, infrastructure, skills, markets, and so on. But if you don't have demanding consumers, you don't have a successful creative economy. One of the few things that I do understand about the Nigerian film industry is that there is a huge appetite for its products. If there was not that appetite, there would not be a film industry. It's an obvious point to make. But if we don't have education systems and media and a public environment which is encouraging people to engage in creative and cultural goods and services, you cannot have a functioning creative economy. You have to have an audience, and the more demanding the audience is, the more the industry has to step up to meet its needs. So again, one of our slogans has always been, how do we make more demanding? Because if the consumers are demanding, then the producers have to respond to that demand. So thinking about the whole value chain, not just the suppliers, but the buyers, thinking about markets and networks, thinking about infrastructure and skills, not just investing in businesses per se, but investing right across the value chain. And then finally, invest in intermediaries. And by that, I mean banks and governments and investors find it difficult to understand the creative economy. What we've done in the UK, and is now happening more and more around the world, Indonesia, South Africa, Korea, Central Asia, all parts of the world, is intermediary organizations pop up which say to the banks and to the investors, we can help you understand this industry. So at Creative England, we did a deal with a bank. They gave us a £25 million fund, which we invested. And our investments were in very small amounts, £10,000 here, £20,000 there. Small investments which the bank would not be interested in and would not have the capacity to do in an engaged way. They didn't understand how to do the due diligence. So we were an intermediary organization that enabled the bank's finance to flow into the creative economy with a degree of security. We undertook to guarantee them a minimum return on their investment, and we charged a small fee for managing it, a classic function for an intermediary organization. Secondly, you need to have intermediaries to work with governments and universities. Why? Because the skills needs of this sector are evolving very, very rapidly. And if there are not higher education institutions and further education institutions, technical institutions, which are capable of supplying the needs for the industry, it will die. But the universities and the education institutions need to understand the needs of industry. So there needs to be some forum in which industry, that practitioners of the industry, small producers, filmmakers, fashion designers, musicians can meet government, can meet with the higher education sector and say, this is what we need. And then you start getting a proper ecosystem going, which can supply the progress of the industry. Thirdly, it's thinking about intermediary other sectors. We think of the creative economy as being very much about entertainment, but actually the skills of the creative industries, particularly, for example, video games, are beginning to be applicable in health, in education, in engineering, right across the piece, in public administration. In Shanghai, the new traffic control system in Shanghai is based on games industry software. They would not have the sophistication of traffic management without having a sophisticated games industry. That's how integrated the creative industries are becoming in the rest of the economy. And I think it's an important way of encouraging investors and governments to take this sector seriously. It impacts on other sectors. And then finally, I mentioned here clusters and hubs because, as I said at the beginning, so many of these businesses are small, they're fragmented. People very often do not know that there is somebody in the next town, in the next street, in the next neighborhood who has a skill that they need for their business. One of the things that we have focused on in the UK and elsewhere is to build networks of creative people so that you get the creatives, the technicians, the financiers, the lawyers, the accountants communicating with each other. Because if you don't do that, then you never achieve the growth potential of these small businesses. They're not plugged into the range of skills and networks that they need. So invest in intermediaries. And I'm sorry, that's a very, very rapid run through what seem to me some of the challenges that investors face and some of the ways in which those challenges can be met. And I hope we can explore some of that in the discussion. Finally, just a little quote, which I'm sure many of you know already. If oil was the fuel of the 20th century economy, creativity is the fuel of the 21st century economy. The difference between the two is that the more oil you use, the less you have, and the more we pollute the planet. The more creativity we use, the more creativity we get. And the one thing we know is that the supply of creativity is unlimited. There are hundreds of millions of young people around the world who are now getting access to smartphones, are raising their ambition, raising their aspirations. It's connecting that talent with the market, with the money they need, the markets they need, and the networks they need that will grow the creative economy, not just in Africa, but everywhere in the world. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, John, once again for that insightful presentation.
Apologies, I overran my time, Blessing. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think we can still manage the time. Thank you so much. All right, so this brings us to our second speaker, Ojoma Ochai. Ojoma Ochai is managing partner at the creative economy practice at CcHUB. She's also co-founder of Pixel Ray Studios, a global film and audio-visual content infrastructure development company currently developing projects in Africa and the Caribbean. She sits on the board of B Trust, an organization set up by Jay-Z and Jack Dorsey, CEO of Block Inc. and co-founder and former CEO of Twitter, to support Bitcoin development in Africa and other nations. Her 17 plus years of experience spans international cultural relations and leading creative and digital economy projects, including at the intersection with tourism and heritage. Her previous roles have included being Regional Director for British Council Sub-Saharan Africa Arts and Creative Economy Program, and other roles working on projects for institutions like the Swedish Arts Council, World Bank, and various national governments to support the development of the creative economy. Ojoma will be taking us through the African creative economy, funding and investment opportunities to stimulate economic, cultural, and social benefit. Over to you, Ojoma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ojoma Ochai. I'm the managing partner of the creative economy practice at CcHUB, as has already been said. It's really exciting to be talking to you today in this first session of our Funders and Investors Masterclass. I'm going to try and situate some of what John has talked about in a specifically African context. There will be some repetition, so bear with me and bear with us. It's deliberate to reiterate the importance of having a full ecosystem and value chain approach to funding and investment. And in our experience in the work that we've done with funders and investors on the continent, I think that's the fundamental building block that we need to master and wrap our heads around if we're going to progress the funding and investment landscape on the continent. And so I'm going to go through a few slides, and I really look forward to a discussion in the next section of the program today. Right, so as a reminder, when you talk about the creative economy, and we went through this in last year's series, but as a reminder, there are quite a few sectors that you need to consider when you're thinking about the creative economy. Increasingly, the lines between these sectors are blurred. So when you think about, for example, sectors like music, which you will get in terms of the new media sector, recorded music and stream music, you cannot take that away from the infrastructure around performing arts, for example, with live events and the expertise around performing arts being correlated to what happens in live events. So these are the sectors as a reminder. But I think the point I really want to make is it's increasingly valuable to think about these sectors as dynamic and blending into each other. You know, film and music correlate strongly. Traditional cultural expressions and traditions are inspiring contemporary music and inspiring storylines for film and so on and so forth. So the additional point I want to make in thinking about the creative economy sectors is that they're dynamic and sometimes they're quite clear in terms of the delineation, but increasingly not so much. All of these sectors are more than the outputs that you see, which is a misconception that we see a lot of investors and funders make. When funders and investors are thinking about film, often they're thinking about the outputs. And so when they're looking at things to fund, often they're thinking about how might I fund a film. If they're really creative, they're thinking about maybe how might I fund production or how might I fund distribution. All this is well and good. But if we want to advance the investor and the funding ecosystem, we have to be thinking about the complexity and the different elements of activities across the value chain. One of the areas that I think we need to really be thinking about in the creative production side of things is activities relating to development of creative outputs. It's not enough to fund a film. How about the development of the script? How about the development of the story? At the moment, in many productions on the continent, we're not spending enough time or devoting enough resources at that early stage of development of the creative output. And so that's an area that I think that increasingly as funders and investors, we need to think about. I think also in terms of creative production, supporting the physical infrastructure is critical. And the physical infrastructure cuts across a number of things, which we will talk about in a later part of my presentation. And then there's creative services at that development stage, which again, we will talk about. Then for distribution, of course, we're familiar with digital and physical distribution, but we need to be thinking more about the media infrastructure, right? The investment in the marketing of the film, for example, investments in value-added media activities that can extend the reach for the content that we're making, for example, or the creative products that we're making. I think also thinking about supporting technology services. How might we use things like AR, for example, augmented reality, virtual reality, to extend the film experience or extend the marketing experience or extend the viewing experience when you're talking about content? Or how might we use AR and VR to enhance performing arts and the experience for people that are attending and participating in some of these activities? So I think funders and investors need to think a lot more broadly about what's available to be invested in all of these sectors, and think about a holistic value chain and ecosystem approach, so that we're not only focusing our investment and our fund on the outputs as we've typically done, or the sort of obvious distribution and production infrastructure. This is actually education and skills across the value chain, production skills, marketing skills, legal skills, and so on. Somebody needs to be funding, somebody needs to be investing in that. We can't wait at the cycle and expect a certain level of quality or a certain level of sophistication if there's no one funding the capacity that needs to be present at the beginning. There's also investment around management. Even when we think about talent and education, often funders are funding development of creative talent. And whereas there's so many management skills, technical skills that we need to be investing more in. So we need to be thinking about those. Legal and accounting, intermediaries and advocates, associations, intermediaries like hubs, not dissimilar to the creative economy practice at CcHUB, but there are other networks and collectives that are supporting either cutting across the sector or targeted at specific subsectors like fashion, for example. So there's so many opportunities to support intermediaries to strengthen their role as ecosystem builders. And then there's the public sector as well. The actions of the public sector have often a problem if they don't have capacity, and then of course becomes really difficult. And then of course investors and financiers like yourselves in the room, if I have this regard to yourselves, it is that we need to be a lot more sophisticated in our understanding of what actually happens in the creative economy. About this idea of a mixed funding, and it's this idea that not any one type of funding can address the needs and the opportunities in the sector. And that's why for this, for example, we're targeting a range of funders and funders to debt funders to even intermediaries to equity type funders. And so that mixed economy is this idea that we have to leverage different types of financial instruments to address the needs of businesses at different stages. The type of money that's required at experimentation and R&D and development is not necessarily the type of money that's required at the stage of making the film, right? The type of money that's required for product prototyping in fashion or accessories or craft is not the same type of funding at the stage where somebody has a collection that they need to put out or they have an order that they need to fulfill. So it's important that as funders and investors, we recognize the need for diverse funding sources. And I think the onus is on us, on you as funders, to invest in the development of that mixed economy ecosystem for funding. Because if you're funding at a later stage, then the strength of the investment and funding pipeline at the earlier stage is you have a vested interest in ensuring that that works so that you have a stronger pipeline. I hear a lot of investors say the pipeline is weak. And I feel like that's a bit of a cop-out because we all have a role as funders in this ecosystem to be investing and funding and supporting what's happening downstream that will enhance the activities if you're working upstream. If you're an early stage funder, a grant funder maybe, again, I think there's an onus to strengthen the mixed economy model, because what happens if you give people that initial 5K, 10K, 20K grant fund? Where do they go from there? You've supported them to develop skills, you've supported them to develop business capacity, and then you've given them a small seed injection, and then what happens next? So I think there's a real impetus and there's a real need for us to have much more diverse funding sources and strengthen the investment ecosystem. Another reason is it mitigates risk. The stronger the development capital, the stronger the early stage of the pipeline, the stronger the pipeline and the lower the risk, in a sense, further down the line. So that's another reason why we have to all be working towards this mixed economy investment and funding landscape. Another reason why this is important is because it caters to unique needs. There's some projects or organizations that will never be commercial, right? But they need to exist for us to have the research and development, the context, the working environment, the policy environment that will make the commercial sector succeed. And if we're not deploying funding towards that not-for-profit, never going to be commercial aspect of things like policy advocacy, like development sometimes, because not everything that you invest development money in will succeed. If we're not getting the type of instruments that is needed at that early stage or at that policy advocacy or ecosystem strengthening stage, then we're not catering to the different types of businesses and their unique models. Another reason why mixed economy is important, it fosters innovation because there's the entry barriers are lowered and more people can experiment. It ensures growth. The sector is growing with all of the issues we talk about in relation to access to finance. And so we believe, we're convinced that a much more structured and robust funding ecosystem will stimulate and further catalyze that growth. We need to balance public and private interests. Creative industries have dual value. They have economic value, but they also have cultural value. Music, film, our clothing, fashion, performing arts, visual arts, these are all ways that we express our identity and express who we are at a national level, at a regional level. And so interest in ensuring that arts and culture and creative industries thrive. And if we don't have a mixed economy, what then happens is only what will sell gets made. And what we sell, or what will sell, may not be representative of the culture or the heritage that we're trying to promote. And so another reason why it's important to have a balanced sort of mixed economy model is we can balance between culture as a cultural public good, or arts and culture and creative industries as a public good versus arts and culture as a means for revenue. Obviously, those two things overlap often, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes we should be funding and investing and supporting arts, culture, and creative industries just because, right? Just because they're the way that we express our humanity, our identity, and create a narrative about our countries. Another reason why mixed economy is crucial is because it will stimulate the growth of ancillary services that are crucial for the sector. I'm going to try and whiz through now some practical examples, because we want you to leave here with a stronger sense of what does this all mean, right? If I'm a grant maker or if I'm a debt financier, what are the kinds of things I could potentially be looking at investing in? And we've tried to distill what I've just said in the previous sort of 10 minutes into practical things that you can take away. And we've done it through the lens of only 3 sectors. But you can do this for all of the sectors in the creative industry. There's so many areas of investment and funding instruments that offer a range of benefits. There are economic benefits, there's social benefits, and there are cultural benefits. So depending on what type of investor you are, you can derive all kinds of benefits using all kinds of instruments to fund the industry. And that's what we're going to be trying to illustrate in the next few slides. So starting with fashion, an area of potential investment or funding is in education. We have a plethora of fashion design schools, fashion institutes, training centers, vocational centers. And when you're thinking about investment in this education, it needs to be a combination of funding instruments, from grants to endowments to training institutions. Endowments to training institutions to help them hire better staff, develop their curriculum, apply technology, long-term low interest rates that help them keep at a level of standard that will enable the outputs that we want to see from the sector. Even scholarships to support students to go to these fashion institutions are critical. And these offer a range of benefits. We have a skilled workforce that can work in the commercial sector. We empower people and we create job creation we create jobs within local communities. And often there's a benefit that we preserve and promote traditional techniques, whether it's in terms of textile design or in terms of tailoring practices. There's so many traditional techniques we can preserve. Production facilities are another place of investment in fashion, from textile and product manufacturing. So for like makers of one, production facilities are an area of investment, tailoring facilities. And again, there are different types of funding instruments that can be used here: venture capital, equity investments, soft loans. Often when funders provide debt for fashion, they tend to provide them for equipment and so much more hardcore infrastructure. Sometimes they just want a soft loan to cover their running costs for a period while they wait to fulfill an order or something. Government subsidies. What does this do? Again, there's enhanced capacity through production, job creation and income generation, and local craftsmanships and creativity are enhanced. Similarly, there's opportunities for investment in equipment and technology through equipment leasing services, grants, asset financing, which have, again, a range of economic, social, and cultural benefits that are not dissimilar to what has already been talked about. There's opportunity for funding marketing and branding through sponsorship, through brand capital, brand partnerships and collaboration, through venture capital. And by the way, these funding instruments are not exhaustive of how you can look at different areas of investment, even within one sector, and think about the different instruments that you can use and think about the kinds of value that you can derive. For infrastructure, there's partnerships. When we're talking about other sectors, it's always easy to think about public-private partnerships, but we never think of creative industries in that light. So there's really definitely an opportunity to think of large-scale public-private partnerships in terms of infrastructure development, production parks, large-scale production infrastructure, long-term investment in technology, and so on and so forth. R&D for fashion, opportunity for government grants to enhance innovation and product diversification, to advance sustainable ethical practices, to fuse the modern and the traditional. There's also opportunities to invest in sustainable practice and use green bonds, impact investments, CSR funding to help fashion companies adopt more sustainable practices that have economic, social, and cultural benefit. Similarly, for film, there are opportunities in similar areas in education and production facilities, in equipment procurement, and other value chain activities, which we'll also talk about later. There are so many opportunities for grants and scholarships in education. I already talked about curriculum development. Often when we're making investments in education, we're either funding short-term workshops, which are interesting, but we will never be competitive with short-term training. We're competing on a global scale where people are spending years learning how to make film. And I'm not to say that's the model, but if we don't invest in the quality education from early on, apprenticeships and so on, research, if we're not funding that, then we can expect that we will only go so far in terms of what we can do in these sectors. Again, there are economic, social, and cultural benefits to these around talent development, community engagement, promotion of local languages in our film and in our content. I also really wanted to touch on this idea of equipment leasing, because as many of our film industries and production and content industries grow, even though the barriers to equipment are in terms of accessibility, have the scale equipment and equipment that we need. And it doesn't have to be every single production company having every single piece of equipment. When we look at film sectors that we want to be like, there are all kinds of equipment procurement and upgrade programs. We need to start thinking about how might we use different types of funding instruments to achieve value. Music, right? Who's putting corporate sponsorship and even investment and debt financing into festivals and events that showcase artistic expression? There's a lot of evidence that festivals and events have both direct and indirect benefit in terms of local tourism and hospitality. If we had large-scale festivals, think about the hotel revenue, think about the food revenue, think about the other things that people will do when they're in town for a festival. We need to be thinking deeply about how we support festivals and events. Music labels, depending on your school of thought, this may be going away or soon, or maybe not. Music export programs, how are we supporting musicians? Apart the will be Madison Square Garden or the O2, but the next generation, who's supporting them to go to international music festivals? Who's supporting them to do international showcases? Similarly with this sector, production facilities, equipment, distribution, education. So the areas overlap, and nothing says you can't take festivals and events and consider that in the context of fashion or film. These are all illustrative to help us to open our minds about what's available to be funded in all of these sectors. And then we have this final bit about what we're calling general services. For the sector to work as a business, as we always talk about, it's not magic. There are non-creative skills that are required, or let's say non-artistic. Accounting, law, PR, marketing. There are opportunities to invest in companies that are providing these services specifically to the creative industries. And so I think that as funders, whether you're a grant funder, debt, equity, we need to be thinking a lot more broadly. We need a lot of compliance and risk management increasingly in our large-scale projects and productions. Who's funding the development of that capacity that's specific to the creative industries? So that's me done. These are various opportunities. I'd really like to have a conversation and listen to your questions. But I think if I leave you with one word, it's that if we must, funders and investors need to think a lot more broadly about what's available for funding, a lot more strategic in thinking about the instrument to fund. And we all, as funders and investors, need to be thinking about how we strengthen this ecosystem of funding and investment, so that across there is the right type of investment and funding to the right type of company. So a strengthened mixed economy ecosystem of funding and investment. Thank you all very much for listening.